us
here
the
watching
signal
John
when he's
speak.
ready.
I'll get as a school board.
All right, Cindy.
All set? Okay, well,
Good job.
wait a minute. Gotta wait for it to appear on the screen.
There you go.
All right, welcome to the special meeting of the Budget Committee. This is September 30th, 2014, and I'll call the meeting to order, and if we could begin with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, the purpose of tonight's meeting is we have a guest here tonight with us, which is Cordell Johnston, Attorney Cordell Johnston from the New Hampshire Municipal Association. New Hampshire Municipal Association offers training and advice to elected officials in New Hampshire. And so we asked if he would be willing to come and just talk to us about roles and responsibilities of elected officials, specifically budget committee members. But we did invite the town and the school district to come if they were so interested and ask questions and learn. So I think, first of all, I just want to welcome you. And I figure I will start by introducing who we are. Over here we have Dan Valancourt.
Hi.
We have Chris Biscucci, Ray Peoples. Michelle Flynn is our recording secretary. Myself, Cindy Couture, I'm the chair. We have Carrie Douglas. We have Andrew Cutter. Brian Bork is the representative from the school board. And we have Frank Byron, who's a representative from the town. And then in the audience, we have Jason Hoke, who is the town administrator. We have John Burnell, who's the selectman. And we have Jason Garrett, and you are on the planning board. Okay. So that is who we are in the room anyways. And we may have many, but we are being televised, so we may have many more people who cannot make it here tonight watching on TV.
Okay.
So what I think I will do, if you have a presentation, what I'll do afterwards, if the budget committee has questions, I want you folks to go first, and then after you feel that your questions have been answered, then I will open it up to the audience. Okay? Welcome.
Thank you. Again, my name is Cordell Johnston, and I'm with the New Hampshire Municipal Association. And my title there is Government Affairs Counsel. I actually spend most of my time, at least during the legislative session, I spend most of my time at the legislature dealing with bills that affect city and town government. So I'm a lobbyist, but I'm also an attorney, and during the off-season, I pitch in and answer legal questions from cities and towns and do presentations like this and write articles and things. So I'm happy to be here. Just a few logistical things. I think I saw on your agenda that you have me going until about 8:30.
We have however long you need to take.
Okay, well.
We don't have a set end time.
I can go until 8. I can go longer than that. If you want me to go longer, I can. If you get tired of me before then, feel free to let me know, or maybe the deadly silence will let me know.
The snoring.
And also, I don't foresee this as a lecture where I just talk for an hour and then people ask questions. If you want to ask questions as we go, I would certainly encourage that. That my speaking style is more conducive to discussion rather than lecturing. And so I just want to make sure I understand. So this is the budget committee, including the selectmen's representative and the school board rep, and is there anyone?
We are missing one member.
Okay,
So one member of our, Bill Spencer is not here tonight.
Okay, and the rest of you are elected, I assume?
Yes.
At large, okay, as opposed to appointed. Okay. I have a couple of handouts, and I think I have extras for if people in the audience want to take one. That This is just a document that I prepared for this presentation, the role of the Municipal Budget Committee. And I think that this pretty much covers what you're interested in hearing about, but if it seems like I'm going in a direction different from what you were expecting, and if you think I should be covering something that I'm not, feel free to butt in and let me know that. And some of this I can skip over it. I don't need to go into detail on everything that's in the handout. Some things I think we can discuss in more detail than others. But I think the first thing to start with is the nature of a municipal budget committee and understanding what its place is in the town or in the school district. I think the biggest problems that we encounter with budget committees and the questions that we have with respect to budget committees have to do with tension, typically between the budget committee and the Board of Selectmen. Often the school board as well, but it seems to be more issues between the budget committee and the selectmen, and often it has to do with, I would say, sort of turf wars, disagreements about who's the boss, and I often hear questions, well, do we work for them or do they work for us? And those are that's the source of a lot of the issues that we seem to hear about. And the answer to the question, do we work for them or do they work for us, is neither. You work together. You're two different bodies, and you have pretty clear responsibilities. There are places where they overlap, but the division of responsibilities is pretty clear, and I'll talk about that in some detail this evening. But to the extent you can understand those responsibilities and understand that you need to work together, I think you avoid a lot of the problems that budget committees and selectmen have in many towns. And at the beginning of the municipal budget statute, which is RSA 32, and I assume that most of you are somewhat familiar with that, or at least know that there is a statute that governs what you do. There's a statement that says the budget committee in those municipalities which establish one is intended to have budgetary authority analogous to that of a legislative appropriations committee. So we can make the analogy, and Frank will understand this. Hopefully, all of you will understand it. But if you think about the state legislature, and if you think about how the budget process works there, the municipal budget committee is very analogous to the finance committee in the legislature. And there's a finance committee in the House and the finance committee in the Senate. But I think it's probably best analogous to the finance committee in the House. And I have another handout. This is a very simple kind of a map that I laid out that compares the budget process at the state level to the budget process at the town level. And they are, there are obviously some differences, but they're very similar. Both processes start with department heads preparing their estimates of expenditures needed for the coming year. And at the state level, the department heads prepare those, They provide them to the Commissioner of Administrative Services, who prepares a tentative budget for submission to the governor. And the governor reviews those estimates and prepares her budget. At the town level, the same thing happens, although you skip a step. The department heads and other officials prepare their statements of estimated expenditures and revenues, and they provide that to the governing body, the selectmen, who are, if you think about it, analogous to the governor. They're the head of the executive branch of the government. And the governing body, the selectmen, prepare their budget recommendations. And then going back over to the House side, the state side, the governor submits her budget to the legislature, and it goes to the House Finance Committee. And the House Finance Committee takes that budget and often just kind of throws it in the trash and says we're going to start over. But ideally, they take it and they use that as a blueprint for how they're going to draft their budget. Similarly, on the town side, the selectmen and the school board will submit their budget recommendations to the budget committee. The budget committee drafts its budget and puts that forward, and that budget goes to the legislative body, which is the town meeting or the school district meeting. So you have, again, similar to at the state level, you have two entities with budget authority, but they have different authority, and it is the budget committee that ultimately is responsible for producing the budget. And I hear questions occasionally, is it the selectmen's budget or is it the budget committee's budget? By the time it gets to the town meeting, it is very definitely the budget committee's budget. It's not the selectmen's budget. They have their recommendations, but it's but it's your budget. I'll back up just a little bit and talk about the establishment and the organization of the budget committee. You have a budget committee because at some point, and I don't know when, maybe someone who's been around for a while knows when, but at some point the town voted to establish a budget committee. There are a lot of towns that do not have a budget committee, and the town has one only if there has been a vote by the legislative body, the town meeting, to establish a budget committee. And just as the town voted to establish a budget committee, you ought to know that you can be abolished. I don't know whether that ever happens. I have not heard of it happening certainly in recent years, but if the town gets tired enough of you, they can decide we're not going to have a budget committee anymore and submit a warrant article. So someone could submit a warrant article to.
No.
I think it's been tried before.
I'm sure it's been tried, maybe not here, but I'm sure it has been tried in some
here.
towns, because there are people who don't like the idea of a budget committee. But once you get one, I think it's pretty unusual to actually see the successful abolition of a budget committee. The statute talks about the makeup of the budget committee. It can have, or it must have, anywhere from 3 to 12 at-large members. There must be a selectman's representative, and if there is a school district, as there is in Litchfield, that's wholly within the town, then there's a school board representative on the budget committee. If there, I guess Litchfield doesn't have any village districts that are wholly within the town. If there were, the village district commissioners would also have a representative on the budget committee. And the The members at large are either elected by the voters or appointed by the moderator, which is kind of a curious thing. I don't know of any town where they're appointed by the moderator, but that is something that is decided at the time the committee is established. The chair of the committee has to be one of the at-large members. It can't be the school board or the selectman's representative. And one thing I don't know whether you're aware of this, there is a provision in the statute that says that an at-large member will immediately cease to hold office upon missing 4 consecutive meetings without being excused by the chair. It's not maybe removed, or the board may consider removing that person. It is that if you miss 4 consecutive meetings without excuse, you're automatically off the budget committee. It's probably in there because the legislature knew that serving on the budget committee would not be a whole lot of fun, and so they wanted to give you an incentive to come to the meetings. One of the things that is, I think, very important to understand is that, and this is just like the Board of Selectmen, the Budget Committee can only act as a committee. No individual member of the committee has any authority, or has any more authority than any other citizen of the town. So just because you're on the Budget Committee, you don't have any special rights that another citizen doesn't have, acting in your own capacity. It's only the committee as a committee that has authority. So I said I would talk about the division of responsibilities between the Budget Committee and the governing body, the Board of Selectmen. So I have, in the handout, I've set out what the principal duties and authorities of the Budget Committee are. And the first one, the biggest one, the primary duty, the reason that the Budget Committee really exists, or the primary reason the Budget Committee exists, is to prepare the budget and to submit that to the town meeting, as well as the school board budget. And again, if you had a village district wholly within the town, you would be responsible for preparing that budget as well. And there's a schedule that you need to follow, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, about when all of that gets done. The committee is required to confer with the governing bodies, the selectmen and the school board, and with other officials and department heads regarding costs, revenues, and services to the extent deemed necessary by the Budget Committee. And the statute specifically says it shall be the duty of all such officers and other persons to furnish such pertinent information to the Budget Committee. So that's one instance in which I suppose you could say that the selectmen do work for you, in that they are required to provide that information to you when the Budget Committee requests it. The committee is responsible for the budget hearings that are required by law to take place prior to the annual town meeting and school district meeting. And again, there's a schedule for when that has to take place. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. We publish a calendar of important dates that's probably, I hope, hanging in the selectman's office or the town administrator's office, and it lists all the dates for towns with a traditional town meeting, towns with an SB2 town meeting, whether they're March or May, and it has all of the deadlines, the date by which the budget has to be submitted to be posted with the warrant, the date by which you have to have the last budget hearing, et cetera. So as you're going through the process, it's useful to consult with that. We just put the important dates calendar for 2015 on our website. I'm not sure whether the hard copy has come out yet. It's coming out pretty soon.
So it's on, because about a week ago I looked, and it was still the 2014 calendar, so it's been updated for the 2015 season?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep. And there are a few dates that have changed with respect to SB2 towns. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. Once you hold your budget hearing, it is the responsibility of the committee to forward the budget and their recommendations on special warrant articles to the clerks of both the town and the school district, as well as to the governing body, because the governing body has to post the budget with the warrant. And actually, this is one of the things that have changed. On page 2 here, I say that the budget has to be delivered to the selectmen for posting with the warrant at least 20 days before the annual meeting. In fact, beginning in 2015, for an SB2 town, rather than counting the days, the deadline for delivering that budget to the selectmen is going to be the Thursday before the last Monday in January. If you ever look at all the deadlines in the RSA 4013, which is what we think of as the SB2 statute, there are a number of places like that. You know, the Friday before the second Monday after the third full moon, and it seems to get more complicated every year, because every year someone finds something in the schedule that doesn't work quite right, and the legislature has to change it. But that's the new deadline.
So can you repeat that one? Thursday before the last Monday?
Yeah, it's
Oh, it is?
yeah, the Thursday before the last Monday in January will be the date by which the budget has to go to the selectmen. So that's really, I guess, your kind of drop dead date. That's when you have to get everything done. And you ought to, and I assume you do, kind of start from that. And there's all this stuff that happens in January, and you back up from there to figure out, okay, well, if that has to happen in January, then when do we have to start our review of the budget? And if we're going to do that, and I think you said, Cindy, that you're going to be starting that in October.
Yes.
If we're going to start that in October, when do we have to get all the information from the selectmen? And then when do they have to get the information from the department heads? I think it's very important to have, ideally, a clear schedule, but if not a schedule with dates and deadlines, at least a good working relationship, so you know that we're going to get this information in plenty of time to start reviewing the budget and then be able to have our budget hearings in January. And then the other major responsibility of the Budget Committee is to meet periodically during the year to review comparative statements of appropriations and expenditures, which the governing body is required to provide to you upon request. But that brings up one very important limitation that is not always understood by Budget Committee members, and that is that the Budget Committee does not have authority over expenditures. It's a Budget Committee, not an expenditure committee. Once the budget has been prepared and submitted to the town meeting, that is really the extent of your authority to control the process until you start again the next year preparing the next year's budget. the statute clearly says that it will not be construed to mean that the Budget Committee has any authority to dispute or challenge the discretion of other officials over town or district expenditures. That really is in the discretion of the selectmen or the school board, as the case may be.
So that begs the question of, why does the Budget Committee review comparative statements throughout the year if we don't have any authority to challenge them or question them? And
Yep.
that part of the paragraph that says the committee can initiate removal proceedings if it finds that the governing body or town manager has violated the law. If we didn't challenge or question, how would we know a violation has occurred?
Well, I guess when it says you don't have any authority to dispute or challenge, I think anyone always has the ability to go to the selectmen and say, hey, I don't think you're spending this money the way you're supposed to, but you don't have the, I think what it's saying is you don't have the legal authority to undo something that the selectmen have done. They've said, we're going to spend, we're going to give the town administrator a $10,000 a year raise. You don't have the authority to go and say, no, you're not, as long as they're not overspending the bottom line. So certainly, the Budget Committee, or for that matter, any citizen, I think, has the ability to question the selectmen about it, but they don't have the authority, they don't have any legal authority to override what they've done. And I think your first question, if you don't have authority to control expenditures, then why are you supposed to meet during the year to review the statements of appropriations and expenditures? I think that's because budgeting is, although you don't really start getting into next year's budget until the fall, it really is a year-long process, it's an ongoing process to understand what our expenditures are and what we're spending money on, and it's helpful through the course of the year just to see how the expenditures are matching up against the appropriations. I suspect that you have a lot more meetings starting, say, from October through January than you have from March through September. And the March through September meetings are, I think, really mostly to see how things are going.
And I can tell from body language that these two have questions.
No, for me, it's getting hot in here, so I just wish there was some
okay.
air movement. But I think it's clear to me, but I just ask it another way. The Budget Committee, or any single or group of members on the committee, let's get back to that $10,000 raise, for example, because you brought it up. Mm-hmm. If that did happen to have full right to question and say why, and express opinion that we think that's not right, or that wasn't the will, or whatever, but in reality, the selectman's rep could just say thank you and move on and ignore anything. I mean, so we're all clear on what we're allowed to do and where the limits are.
Right.
But what you're saying is it could be discussed, concerns could be brought up.
Yes.
But then it ends right there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess I wouldn't say it, I think legally it ends right there. You bring up the issue, and the selectman's rep says, thank you, that's the end of it. There are often political solutions when there aren't legal remedies. If you find that the selectmen are routinely going significantly astray from what appears to be the will expressed by the voters when they adopt the budget, then, elect different selectmen. But as far as legal authority to do something, that doesn't exist.
Thank you.
Andrew, did you have a comment or a question?
I was reading ahead, so I have questions ahead.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So then, just talk briefly about the duties and authority of the governing body. They're responsible, as I already talked about, to review statements of estimated expenditures and revenues that they get from the department heads, and submit their own budget recommendations to your committee. And the statute says, at such time as the budget committee shall fix. And so I don't know whether you have a specific date by which you say, we want all of this by October 1st, or whether it's, as I suggested, would be perfectly appropriate, just more of a collaborative process that you work on getting it as you can.
Yeah, generally, the selectmen and the school board work out a schedule for themselves, present it to us, and we use that as a guideline to determine then when they finish with it a week or two later, we then review it. So, yeah, I think we work cooperatively in terms of a schedule for reviewing.
Yep, okay. So their responsibility is to get that information from the department heads, make their budget recommendations, submit their recommendations to the budget committee, and then their responsibilities, they don't end, but they're sort of suspended for a while you take what you've gotten and you prepare the budget. That entire process is simply the budget committees. It's not the selectmen. And then once you finish, you go through the budget hearings and you come up with your final recommended budget that's going to go to the town meeting and the school district meeting. You, as I said, you ship that off to the selectmen. The original goes to the town clerk and the school district clerk, and copies to the selectmen, which then they must post with the warrant, and they have to satisfy their deadline for posting the warrant.
So I have another question related to that. When you talk about the selectmen get their information from the department heads, then once the budget committee gets the budget, it's our time to work it over. And it says it shall be the duty of officers and other persons to furnish such pertinent information. Is it, for example, say the budget committee is deliberating over the incinerator, and we say, you know what, we have a whole lot of questions. We want the head of that department to come in so that we can get some back and forth questioning. Is that appropriate for the committee, or should we go through the selectmen and say, hey, we've got questions?
No, I think it's absolutely appropriate to have the department head come in, because again, it's, at that point, it's your budget. I don't think you can make anyone come in and talk to you. And I don't know whether that's been an issue, but again, it shouldn't be, you're not on opposite sides here. It should be everyone working together. So if the budget committee has questions, and it's certainly natural that it would, as you go through the process, it's certainly appropriate to ask the police chief, the transfer station superintendent, the road agent, whoever, to come in and answer your questions, and I would hope that ordinarily they would do so willingly. If they don't, as I said, I don't think you can subpoena them to come in and testify, but do what you can to get them in. And I think that most people, most department heads would recognize that it's better to come in voluntarily and answer your questions than to get into a battle with you.
Mm-hmm. I think some of what I know in the past has happened is sort of a protecting of the department heads. You know the middle school principal's always gonna agree to do with less. You always know, the fire chief may agree to, cut something and bring it up next. So I think when it's been an issue, it's because some people kind of know in a small town, what kind of answers you're going to get from this person may be different than the answers you're going to get from that person. So that's why I asked that question, because I know there have been in the past some issues where department head, you know, department heads have not, the selectmen or the school board have not wanted department heads to be the people on the front line, so to speak. So that's why I wondered, what was our responsibility? If we really felt like the only person we were going to get, you know, some detailed answers were the department head, what
Right.
could we require? And I guess we can't require, but we can certainly make it known that we want.
Can request it. There's a provision, and I think hope I can find it pretty quickly, in the statute that says that you can request, well, I'm looking at 3217, and what it says, it's not exactly what I was thinking. It says, department heads and other officers shall submit their statements of estimated expenditures and receipts to the budget committee if requested. That's not exactly what I was thinking. But again, you can request them to come in. But, you know, if the selectmen prefer that questions be directed to them rather than to the department heads, I think that's something that you ought to, that it's best to try to work out with
Work
them.
out together.
Yeah.
And I think it looks as though 32:16 is where it says, confer with governing bodies and other officials, department heads relative to estimated costs and services to the extent deemed necessary by the budget committee. I think that's that, to the extent deemed necessary by the budget committee, is where in the past the budget committee has said, hey, we understand, you know, you're the superintendent, you're the administrator, whatever, we really want it straight from the horse's mouth, and we deem that necessary. So I think that's the sentence that's been kind of used in the past to sort of put a little pressure.
Yeah, and I don't think that, either of the governing bodies can stop you from communicating with the department head. So, again, everything is best if you can work it out. But if the selectmen say to you, no, you cannot, you cannot email the police chief and ask him or her to provide this information, I would say they don't have the authority to stop you from doing that. But again, I hope that it doesn't come to that. So those are the duties of the governing body. And again, as I say, I think the split of responsibilities is fairly clear. We then get into some areas where there is some overlap of responsibilities, and I'll talk about recommendations on warrant articles. The statute states that with respect to special warrant articles, and that's a defined term, and it's a limited number of kinds of warrant articles. With respect to special warrant articles, the warrant that goes to the town meeting or the school district meeting shall indicate whether the appropriation in the special warrant article is recommended by the governing body and whether it is recommended by the budget committee. So if you have special warrant articles, and those are defined in 32.3, I think. Yeah, 32.3, Roman numeral 6. If you have special warrant articles, both the selectmen or school board and the budget committee separately need to vote on whether to recommend those, and that recommendation goes on the warrant. And it's quite possible that the selectmen will recommend one and the budget committee will not, or vice versa. The recommendations are not necessarily always the same, as I'm sure you've experienced.
Question at this point. You know, I think this committee is very clear, but perhaps some members that are watching, or some community members that are watching, are not. What happens in a tie vote situation for recommendations?
That's a good question, because ordinarily, with respect to any kind of action that has to be approved by a vote, if there's a tie vote, the action fails. But I guess when you're talking about, no one's ever asked me this question before, so so I'm thinking on my feet here. But I think that if there's a tie vote and you can't, you can't shake someone loose to go to one side or the other, you indicate on the warrant that either a split recommendation, the Budget Committee is evenly divided on whether to recommend it. I'm not sure exactly how you phrase it.
It's either not recommended or recommended.
Well, it's a split vote on on whether to recommend or not recommend.
The motion was, if the motion was to recommend, there was a tie vote, you'd say to recommend 8-8, as an example,
Right. And
or to not recommend.
And what I would do is, I guess, again, off the top of my head, what I would suggest is you can indicate what the numerical tally of the vote was. So I would say something like, the vote on whether to recommend was 4-4, something to that effect.
And that's what we've done, because honestly, depending on the phrasing of the motion, in the room, you have a pretty good sense of if it's going to be a tie vote. So you wait it out, and if you want it to pass, you wait for the motion that says recommend. If you don't want it, then you wait for the motion. So that's where it's tricky, because it can either be, depending on the wording of the motion, it could be a motion fails to recommend or a motion fails to not recommend.
Yep.
But I think the key then is you have to put the 4-4 vote, the tie vote.
That's what I would do. And there's a provision that's later in the handout that says that the legislative body, the town meeting, can vote to require you, and I don't know whether this has happened in Litchfield, they can vote to require you to put the numerical tally on.
It
Is
has
that-
happened.
We
Okay.
have approved that, yeah.
Okay, so if you're required to do that, then I think that's pretty clear. You indicate what the numerical tally was. It was 4-4, or 3-3, or whatever.
So that makes me wonder if then there is no recommendation. The recommendation is a tie vote. It's neither a recommendation for or against.
Yes.
Over the past couple of years, I can think of a couple of articles that were tie votes. Sure. Yes. And that's probably why I asked the question, because we got into some debate about the word not being included in the warrant article, and how the community would read that as Budget Committee not recommends when it's a tie vote.
Yeah, and can I ask, what did you put on the warrant?
I forget.
Do you remember?
I think we put not
Yeah,
recommend
we put not recommended, right?
by a tie vote
Yeah.
of 4-4.
I mean, I guess if you're putting the vote on there, so people should be able to understand that, but I have a little bit of a reservation about not recommended, because that sounds like recommended against, which it wasn't really a recommendation against, it's no recommendation. So I would put it in as neutral language as possible and indicate what the vote tally was.
How about just no recommendation due to tie vote?
That's what I'm thinking. That
Yes.
may be more accurate.
Is there certain wording that we have to abide by?
There's no,
Back to the rules.
unlike some other things, the statute doesn't specifically, doesn't have quoted language that has to appear. It says that it shall indicate whether the Budget Committee recommends or does not recommend the article.
Even outside the language, wouldn't it be better just to strive for consistency from year to year? And maybe, just like the school board and the Board of Selectmen, they have, a policy and procedure that they follow. Maybe the Budget Committee needs a very loosely coupled policy and procedure, says, if this happens, this is what we do, so that it's contiguous over the life of the Budget Committee. So, as we move forward, that we're always using the same terms, and they don't change from year to year, and they're not subject to interpretation. Once they're resolved, that's the thing that we use to move forward.
Yeah.
I've actually collected, a couple of communities do have roles, like you said.
Bylaws.
Bylaws.
Standard operating, yeah.
Yeah, and I have wondered about that, because we do seem sometimes year to year to struggle.
That's not subject to interpretation.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah, I-
consistent to the voter.
Yeah, look, my goal for asking that question is, in the event that this happens again this year, which I suspect it will, because it's
Yeah.
happened in the past too.
Okay.
Right, I want to be as transparent as possible, right? And if somebody at the voting booth is reading not recommends, and that instantly says, well, I'm not going to recommend it.
Right.
You
And I
know,
think,
I want to make sure that we're being transparent.
and I think what the question was last year was the negative connotation behind,
Not
you know, not recommended.
Right.
It's a 4-4, it's tied. So,
Okay. But now we know we have the ability to at least change the wording, if we so choose to do that.
Yeah, I would recommend, I suggest, I think that's a good idea to have, to agree on what it's gonna be and put that in your rules of procedure, so that you're consistent, and probably do that before the occasion arises, because once the occasion arises, depending on which side you're on, you may not agree on what the language ought to be, so do it in a vacuum rather than in the heat of the moment. And actually, that raises another issue. Ideally, you have a 9-member committee, right? Ideally, this will never happen.
It does.
I know it does. I'm sure there are times when people are absent, and that's unavoidable. I'm wondering about whether there are occasions when people abstain. And I would say there's almost never a reason to abstain. Thinking about budget committees, now, if you think about something like a planning board or a ZBA, there are plenty of times when a member of a planning board may have some kind of conflict of interest because they're an abutter to the property in question, or, their half-brothers, or, their second cousin is the applicant or whatever. And a planning board member might have to recuse himself or herself and not participate in the hearing. But that's different from abstaining. If you don't have something that disqualifies you because of a conflict of interest, which is much less likely to happen, I think, on a budget committee, if you're not required to recuse yourself because of a conflict of interest, if you're there, you shouldn't just abstain because you can't decide whether you should be voting yes or no. I mean, you're elected to make decisions, easy decisions, hard decisions, and if you just say, I'd rather not vote on this, you're not really doing what you're supposed to be doing. So if abstentions are creating tie votes, then the way to avoid that is by not abstaining.
But I can't think of a situation where we run into that.
Yeah, I
think so.
don't think so.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's good.
But that's good to know, because I have heard of when people abstain, I've heard questions of, well, why did they do that? So that's good to know that we anyways shouldn't have a reason.
Right,
Never a good reason.
yeah, okay.
If it's a 4-4 vote, do you have to put recommend or not recommend? Can it be left blank for the people to
No.
assume on their own?
No, you have to, and especially where your town has voted to require the numerical tally, you do have to put that on there. Okay, then still with respect to special warrant articles, if a special article is amended at the deliberative session, you may change your recommendation. If there was a special warrant article to put $100,000 into a capital reserve fund, and it's amended at the deliberative session to put $200,000 into a capital reserve fund, the budget committee can change its recommendation. Recommended it before, not recommend it now, or vice versa. With respect to the operating budget, I've indicated on here that there's no requirement that you that you state your recommendation on the operating budget, and in fact, it doesn't really make sense, or it's unnecessary, because it's your budget. So if it's on the warrant, that indicates that this is the operating budget that the Budget Committee has recommended. Although
Because we do include it.
well, you're now, again, since the town has voted to require it, I guess you are required to show the numerical tally on the operating budget, but if the operating budget is amended, as it frequently is at the deliberative session, until this year, there wasn't any clear provision, but based on legislation that was enacted this year, if the operating budget is amended at the deliberative session, you can, both the Budget Committee and the Selectmen can vote on whether to recommend the revised or the amended operating budget. And the reason that happened, I don't know whether you read or heard about this, in the Allenstown School District, they had, I think it was a $10 million budget going into the deliberative session, and so someone moved to cut it by 10%. So, and the motion passed, and there were 40 people there, and it passed, 21 to 19 or something like that. So by a very small vote, they cut $1 million out of the budget. Both the school board and the Budget Committee kind of freaked out. Said, what do we do now? And they didn't feel they had the authority to say, to put on the ballot that we do not recommend this. So instead, they had to conduct a publicity campaign to get everyone to vote against the proposed budget so that the default budget would take effect. And that's what they did, and it was successful. But as a result of that, the legislature amended it to make it clear that you can, if the operating budget is amended, that you can indicate that the Budget Committee and the Selectmen and the school board, if applicable, do not recommend.
And we had an issue a year or two ago of a warrant article that did not change a deliberative, but the committee chose to revote. And we learned that that was something, because it did not change a deliberative, we could not go back and rethink something we'd already voted on.
Yeah, that's right. The statute says if it is amended, then you can change your recommendation. But but there's no provision for changing your recommendation if it hasn't been amended.
Right.
One other thing, and I don't know whether Litchfield has done this, but the town can vote to require that the tax impact of warrant articles be stated on the warrant. That, however, that's the governing body's determination. They determine whether an article has a tax impact, and if so, they determine, or at least they have, they approve the calculation of what the tax impact is that goes on the warrant.
And is there any standard for that? Because I know there was an issue with the town this past year. What the school district used was the incremental increase or decrease from the current rate. What the town did, and Jason, if I'm not explaining it right, jump in. What the town did was put the total tax rate that would become the new tax rate, and I think people found it confusing. So
They assumed it was the increase.
yeah, they assumed it was the increase, not the new total rate. So is there a standard for how that goes? And Jason, if you need to clarify, jump in.
No, I mean, that was the question, because, the law says the estimated tax impact of the article. Well, the operating budget has a pretty significant number
Right.
for its estimated tax impact.
Right.
And so if you put that number in, I think that's what we did this year. People read it as an increase and said, oh my God, my taxes are gonna go up $3 a thousand, instead of the actual incremental number that came out of your budget, which would have been something like, 5
2
cents,
cents, yeah.
10 cents, whatever it was.
Right.
And it wasn't clear, can you put both? Because the estimated tax impact is a heck of a lot more than 10 cents.
Right. The statute doesn't say, I've seen it done the way the town did it. And when my town does it, even though the town hasn't voted to do it, they put on, if the cost of the operating budget is going to be $3 per thousand, the tax impact they put on there is $3. It's not, the 2 cents that it's going up.
Okay.
That's what I would do.
Again, if everybody's using the same standard, it's clear, right? So we have one part of our community doing one thing, another part of the community doing another,
I
so
would-
we
yeah, I
need a
would-
policy.
I would certainly try to have both of them doing it the same way and have an explanation of what it is.
But that means the school board and the Board of Selectmen need to get together and work something out, right?
Yeah, that would be the,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that doesn't require a joint meeting necessarily of the school board and the selectmen. You
Right.
could have the town administrator communicating with the school superintendent, and just as long as both boards buy into it. The 10% limitation, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And that says that the total amount appropriated at the annual meeting cannot exceed the budget committee's budget by more than 10%, and that is applied to the total amount. All amounts included in the operating, whether they're in the operating budget or in separate warrant articles. And there are some exceptions. There's some things that are not included there. I won't get into that in detail unless that's something that's of particular interest to you. And the two big exceptions to that are for collective bargaining agreements. If you have a cost item, an appropriation to implement a cost item in a collective bargaining agreement, if the budget committee doesn't recommend that appropriation, the appropriation is exempt from the 10% limitation. And then with a bond article, even if the budget committee doesn't recommend the bond article, the governing body can still put it on the warrant. And there's some procedural requirements that apply. And the governing body has to make it clear, they have to include a statement that says that approval of this bond will constitute an override of the 10% limitation. Then the default budget, and obviously all of you know this, if the operating budget is not approved at the meeting, and I think this was the case this year with Litchfield, then the default budget takes effect. The default budget is the amount of the same appropriations that were in last year's operating budget, reduced and increased by debt service, contracts, and other obligations previously incurred or mandated by law, and reduced by one-time expenditures that were in the operating budget. One thing to be clear on is that for purposes of the default budget, the definition of default budget refers to the operating budget, and the statute makes clear that for that purpose, the operating budget means the statement of appropriations and anticipated revenues exclusive of special warrant articles and other appropriations voted separately. So when you're figuring out what the default budget is, you're not looking at anything that you have in a separate warrant article. And an SB2 town, ordinarily, you wouldn't have that many things in separate warrant articles. My town is not an SB2 town, and so we'll have the operating budget, but then we might have, 15 appropriations that are in separate warrant articles. Until recently, they always put the police budget, the fire budget, the road agent budget, the whole thing. Each one was a separate warrant article. and we voted on each one of them separately. You wouldn't do that in an SB2 town, because if you vote no, then the police budget is 0, or the fire department budget is 0. And you can't have that. And that has happened. I can think of one SB2 town a few years ago that, for whatever reason, and I don't remember what department it was, but it was a department with a very large budget and performed a very important service, and somehow that department's budget ended up in a separate warrant article, and it was defeated, and they had no money, which I think they resolved by calling a special meeting.
So you're saying that if it's on a special, or if it's on a warrant article, and the warrant article passes this year, that's not calculated into the next year's default budget?
Well, the short answer is probably not. But if next year, if that's an appropriation that could be included.
Like a contract?
Yeah, if that's an appropriation that could be included in the operating budget article, then I think you could include it, but then you'd have to take last year's appropriation and put it back into last year's operating budget, so you're comparing apples to apples.
Right.
Who owns the default budget?
Who owns the default budget? Well, that's an interesting question.
Two for two.
The answer is the selectmen, unless the town has voted to give that responsibility to the budget committee.
That's right.
So,
We have not, so it is the governing body's
Not.
responsibility.
okay, yeah, and it's 40:14B, I think I have it in here. Yeah, toward the top of page 5, the default budget is calculated by the governing body unless the legislative body, the town meeting, has delegated that responsibility to the budget committee. And that's something that, if the town meeting wanted to do it, it would be, a warrant article would be submitted, and there is specific language in 40:14B that says, you would put on the warrant, shall the town vote to delegate the responsibility for calculating the budget to the budget committee, something like that. And if that's approved, then going forward, it would be the budget committee that calculates that every year, unless and until that authority is rescinded and it goes back to the governing body.
Just out of curiosity, how many towns have passed that? Do you have any idea?
I really don't know. I wouldn't want to venture a guess on that.
And I'm still stuck on so if you have, kind of what Jay said, if you had a special warrant article, a contract for three payments over the next 3 years, it passes, but then when you go to calculate the default budget, that type of warrant article may be included in the calculations of the default?
If you're,
Because it was intended to be a continuation and it was approved?
right, if this year you have a separate warrant article to, do whatever, and that's approved, and unless it was a one-time expenditure, which things that are in separate warrant articles often are, but if it's not a one-time expenditure, if it's something that is expected to be repeated. For example, if you have a warrant article to, no, that's not a good example.
Police contract.
You had two costs of you.
Okay,
Yeah, I did actually sort of outside the bargaining unit one, the one that happened here a few years ago. Town voted for the town to assume the costs of fire hydrants. Okay, so the following year.
and that was in a separate article.
And that was in a separate article.
Yeah.
The following year, our default budget goes up $200,000 to absorb
Yes,
the cost of fire hydrants, because the town voted on it the
Right.
previous year.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's right, that would go into the
And I think
default
some of
budget.
the other times it's been controversial, a position, we're gonna hire X new position. Well, then the following year, does it go in the default or not?
Yep.
It's not, it could be a one-time thing, maybe you don't hire that person again, but how do you guess the intention, or do you just take
I
a
think-
stab at
I
it?
think you need to look at those on a case-by-case
Okay.
basis. And if you have a question, well, just, yeah, look at it very carefully, and if you're not sure, talk to your legal counsel or call us. Costs less to call us. But if, our staff answers general legal questions if you're calling about, some extremely complex situation that involves a whole lot of facts, you're gonna end up needing to talk to your legal counsel. But something like that, yeah, I think it needs to be a case-by-case basis.
Now, I have two questions, because one, Cindy just said, concerns or questions regarding the default budget. It's clear the Budget Committee, similar to earlier discussion we had here, has no authority over the Budget Committee. I'm sorry, the default budget. The Budget Committee has no authority over the default budget.
Right.
But is it safe to believe that the members of the Budget Committee during a meeting can ask questions about the default budget and how did you come up with those numbers?
During a meeting of who?
During a Budget Committee meeting.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so we could ask questions.
Right.
Okay, similar to like when, during the year, when you're asking questions about expenditures. You have no authority to change anything.
Right.
But you could have discussions about them.
Sure.
So it's not taboo to discuss it. It's not just like it's their thing.
Right.
We can't talk about it.
Right.
Okay. Then the next question, which you brought up, your association, and even on your website says you do take calls from elected. You provide general legal assistance to elected and appointed officials from member municipalities by email and telephone.
Right.
Which means members of this board can call you if we had a question, or send you an email, just to get a simple answer or clarification, correct?
Yes, although if the municipality, if the governing body has voted, and there are a number of towns, not by any means a majority, but a number of towns have done this, if the governing body can restrict who they want to allow to call us or email us to get answers to questions. And some towns, I think Litchfield has done this.
This town did something recently, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, some towns say, only the chairman of the selectmen and the town administrator, or any selectman plus the chair of the planning board, the budget committee, et cetera. One town might say anyone except anyone except Chris. I don't. No town has done that, but
Now, a couple questions.
it's really up to the governing body to
So the governing body has the right to do that, so basically it's not fully accurate what's on your website, because it's not, you just don't, it's to some elected members.
Okay, yeah, okay. I mean,
Okay.
we could clarify that. If that clarification isn't there, we could clarify it to say subject to limitation by the municipality.
And I'm just trying to understand,
Yep.
because, yeah, our town did, last year, it's kind of unique. So I guess other towns do it, which is totally legal.
Right.
Why is that done?
Well, because the municipal association, it's a membership organization, so each city or town decides whether it wants to be a member, and we work for our members, but recognizing that a municipality, obviously, there are a whole bunch of people and with a whole lot of different boards and officials. We have to be responsible to somebody. So we say that we are responsible to the governing body. So that's the Board of Selectmen, or the City Council, or Board of Aldermen, depending, or Town Council for the few towns that have councils. So their decision, if they decide, we want any local official to be able to call you, that's fine. And that's the default situation. If we don't get instructions from a city or town, we will take questions from any official in that town.
Well, I can't imagine there'd be any reason to not have 9 people in this case use 9 different brains to ask questions 6 different ways to make sure they get the right answer, even if it all flows through the chair. I mean, you'd want to be able to ask questions in that diverse nature. I would imagine it'd be appropriate to say, if Chris did have a question, copy the chair off to you.
But that's up to you. I mean, well, it's up to the selectmen, how they want to.
I think ultimately the policy was enacted by the board to get the transparency that we knew what the question was and what the answer was versus not knowing what the question was and getting an answer without understanding what the question was for. So it was really about us understanding what's being asked.
Yep.
So that we can understand the question. So there was no intent to restrict. Of course, we asked for some centralized communications so we can make sure the communications happens appropriately. And I think the recent time when you did reach out, they went through the chair and it kind of just funneled up so that all got out there correctly and came back all very quickly. So there's no intent to block anybody from that perspective.
And I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is what Attorney Johnston said at the beginning about authority. Outside of a meeting, we're regular citizens. We have no authority. So I believe if 9 members wanted to ask questions, it would have to be a vote in this room or authority given in this room to the 9 questions that were going out, which of course would be tedious, and then I would think it would be one single document that went out. But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, it gets back to the outside of the meetings, you're a regular citizen, you're not a budget committee.
Well, we will take, again, unless the town has imposed some kind of restriction, we would ordinarily take a question from just an individual member of a budget committee or planning board or whatever. We do get into, because we do that, as you can imagine, we often get into situations where, and I'll take it out of the budget committee context, so no one takes it personally. We have one planning board member calling and saying, I read the law this way, and here's what happened at our meeting, and am I right about this? And we'll look at it, and based on those facts, say, yeah, you're right about that. And then half an hour later, we get a call from another member of the same board who says, here's what happened at our meeting last night. Am I right about this? And then we realize that we haven't gotten all of the facts from the other member of the planning board. So it can get into sort of sticky situations there, but we try to ameliorate that as much as possible. And one way to do that is if the town wants to say that all budget committee questions have to be funneled through the chair, or all planning board questions have to go through the chair, or whatever.
Right, and to answer that, it's you can't make decisions when you're outside the board. You only have authority when you're with the board, but this is educational and research.
Right.
Because I could pick up the phone and call my personal attorney's office, who happens to have 3 government attorneys in there, and ask the same question, and that's allowed. So any one of us could ask any question of anybody, again, unless restricted by the governing body, but the only thing that they could restrict is the New Hampshire Municipal Association. So, so anybody could ask any question of anybody without approval from anybody else in this room to help educate them. But then the goal is you bring it to the room, and you now have a discussion about it and say, this is what I heard, and then Mr. Cuddy will say, I heard differently, and that's how we come to agreement. Or maybe for some information for further research.
Actually, you bring up a good point that I was wondering too, along the same lines of outside of this room, you're just a citizen with no more authority than any other citizen. And when we talked about department heads and getting information to make a good decision, is there any restriction on someone emailing the local police chief and saying, hey, I have these questions and I need answers because I want to understand it better? Or in a small community, you might bump into the fire chief at the local coffee shop and say, hey, give me some idea what's going on because I'm trying to understand this budget item. How do we address those?
Good question, because keep in mind that we have the right to know law, and whether you're on the budget committee or just any citizen, if you want to copy of the, if you want to know how much the police department has spent on, just on salaries for the first 6 months of the year, you want to, and you go to the police chief and ask for a copy of the budget and the expenditures, that is a governmental record that anyone is entitled to get. So certainly a budget committee member has the same right that any other citizen has to get copies of governmental records. Now, if it's something that's not contained in a record, it's not in writing or on a computer file somewhere, it's just in the in the mind of the department head, technically, they're not required to provide it because it's not a governmental record. But if it is in a governmental record, then yes, an individual budget committee member, just like any other citizen, can request that information. But again, as a matter of everyone, and by that I mean the budget committee, the selectmen, and the department heads all working toward the same goal of producing a sound budget, I think it's best to have requests like that come from the committee rather than having the police chief respond to 9 different requests for information.
Okay.
The next thing I wanted to mention briefly was transfer of appropriations, and that is something that is clearly within the discretion of the governing body. Once the budget has been approved, or even whether it's the proposed operating budget that's been approved by the town meeting, or the town meeting has rejected the operating budget, and so you're left with the default budget. In either event, you have a budget that has certain amounts appropriated for certain purposes. The governing body still has the authority, subject to some restrictions, to transfer money from an appropriation for one purpose to an appropriation for another purpose. What they can't do, obviously, is overspend the bottom line, but subject to that, and again, subject to some limitations, they can transfer, make transfers among the different appropriations, and that's not something that the budget committee has any authority over.
But same questions could still be asked, but they cannot be challenged.
Right.
And, so, obviously they can transfer monies to the bottom line. On a multi-year purchase, so say you buy something, a vehicle for 3 years. You lease something for 3 years, out of a default budget. Okay? It's not an operating budget, because the operating budget failed. You're now with a default budget.
Right.
The default budget is now your operating budget. You go lease a vehicle for 3 years.
Yeah.
With a non-appropriations clause.
Yeah.
The next year, you put it in the operating budget, it fails again.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot include that in the default budget again, that payment for that second year of the lease. Or can you? Because it's a multi-year purchase.
And this may be, we actually had this question. It was submitted by Chris Pescucci to the New Hampshire Municipal Association. I don't recall off the top of my head who sent us the answer.
Stephen Buckley.
Stephen Buckley.
Okay.
And he sent a case as an example. And one of the things that struck me, which is why I want to mention it, one of the things that struck me that was part of that case was when the operating budget fails, it is deemed that the default budget is approved.
Right.
And so that was key to me, because that was the feeling that the default budget is not an approved budget. But actually, based on that wording in the case that was given to us, the default budget becomes an approved budget.
That's not my question.
Okay, but I just,
Yeah, I think I understand the question, that if you keep in mind that the budget, whether it's an approved operating budget or a default budget that is deemed approved, it's a bottom line budget. And so if you didn't have this lease payment in your budget, but it's a payment for something, you said this was police?
Police vehicle.
Okay.
Three-year lease.
All right, so it's still an expenditure for the police department, which presumably you do have in your budget. So as long as it's for a purpose that's included somewhere in the budget, as long as you don't overspend the bottom line, you are, the selectmen have the authority to do that. And the default budget for the following year, the number that goes into the default budget doesn't depend on what you spent the money on. It's just what was the total amount, what was the total bottom line of the budget for the current year.
So you could have the lease payment, but you should have a corresponding decreased value elsewhere, so it zeroes out at the bottom.
Presumably,
You
yeah,
cannot add an additional line item with additional monies.
right.
Because on your website, it says the governing body may enter a lease if the equipment is required by the municipality. If it includes a non-appropriation clause, can be approved by simple majority, so we understand that.
Right.
In this case, and the example you had was buying a vehicle.
Yeah.
In this case, voters authorize the BOS to enter that lease agreement and vote to appropriate 1 year of lease payment. That was a default budget issue.
Yeah.
Subsequent years' lease payments can then be included in the operating budget or a separate warrant article. If voters fail in future years to appropriate funds necessary to make the lease payment, the equipment is returned. That's from your website.
All right, I'm not following that exactly, but if we've already answered the question,
Well,
I would
that's
say-
my
yeah.
position is the question wasn't answered, a different
Okay.
question was answered.
All right,
The question, or in other words, what you guys responded to
Yeah.
was not what I believe the question is.
Okay.
So you guys did answer a question, and it's absolutely correct.
Okay.
No problem with it.
yeah,
I don't think it answers the question that was asked, which is, if in 1 year, the Board of Selectmen goes into a lease
Yeah.
with a non-appropriations clause
yeah,
and takes the money out of the default budget, which is now.
Pays for it out of the default.
Yeah, pays for it out of the default, which they legally can.
right,
That if in subsequent years, they can continue that lease without putting it into the operating budget or a warrant article to continue a multi-year purchase. They can't just continue to put it into the default budget and continue it. Because it says here, it says that it must be, in your website says it must be included in the operating budget or a separate warrant article for subsequent years.
all right.
And Jason, so that we can stay, the
Oh, I-
default, the
yeah.
default doesn't have the number in it.
No, I
Yeah.
understand your
Just want to
position.
clarify, it's
And
not, we're not
Jason,
adding that lease.
if you've got a specific, it probably would, and it would be better if you laid it out in an email so that they can look at it
Sure.
and how it's worded.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to,
Conceptualize from here, yeah.
right, but yeah, if you want to do that and.
I will,
and
thank you.
Send it in again,
Yeah.
or send that question.
Board of Selectmen.
Through
It has to go through the
through
chair.
whoever is authorized
Well,
to.
Well, whoever-
Jason doesn't is not a member of this board, so who does he send it to?
I would, his chair, I would assume.
Well, yeah, I'm appointed, so it would go through you
Yeah,
guys,
yeah,
my
yeah.
turn.
It should come through the budget.
Right.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean that it should come through me.
So to keep it going, a different question, but on default budget.
Yeah.
So what types of checks and balances are there at a state level to ensure that the default budgets are being calculated correctly? You know, to prevent items like Mr. Gretz raising.
At the state level?
Right, to ensure that the towns are calculating it correctly. Is there anything? Or do you just take the number that the town says and says, yep, that's our default budget?
Well, there is, there is a DRA form that you have to use to calculate the default budget, and the selectmen or the budget committee, if they've been given that authority, should be consulting with DRA when if there are questions or challenges about what's in the default budget.
I think the challenge, at least from my perspective of the committee, is, and it says it right here, right? Must be, the default budget must be disclosed at the first budget hearing, right? So
Yeah.
we as a committee generally do not see it in advance to be able to effectively challenge it, right? So I have no idea what's in it,
But
but
this
yet I
committee
have.
can't challenge
My
it.
understanding of the RSA's is that default budget must be presented at least by the budget hearing.
Mhm.
It doesn't
Right.
have to be presented earlier.
Right.
This is the
that-
budget hearing.
That's what it says here.
Right.
And
Budget
we
hearing.
don't have any authority to challenge it.
Okay, so we have no idea then how it's calculated or what's actually in it. But yet, if it's passed, we have to assume it as our operating budget.
The way I understand it is, well, no, the truth is, the Budget Committee has no authority to challenge it. There is no, please correct me if I'm wrong, there is no governing body on the state overlooking whatever the number is. Nobody goes through our numbers and checks it.
Right.
So the real only check, which I guess this is where the education and information session, it has to be an individual of the town, whether it be an individual member of any body, elected or appointed, or just a regular citizen. That is the only check and balance. It's an individual, because this body, this group cannot challenge it at all, as a group.
Right, and if the calculation of the default budget, it has been a huge issue in a lot of towns and a lot of school districts, and the selectmen and school boards are often accused of inflating the default budget. And
I've never heard of that.
Go figure.
there's legislation almost every year to try to deal with that concern, and it's one of those things that just doesn't seem to have a real good solution. I mean, I think the best solution is, if you think that people are inflating or manipulating the budget one way or another, is to bring it out in public, and, whether it's the selectmen or the school board, if you think they're doing it wrong, find someone to run against them, and, put up signs that say, Johnston inflates the default budget. Don't vote for him.
Is it fair to say that appropriation is an entirely different standard than level of service? In other words, if it costs me $10 to operate this year and $20 next year, it's not level of service that I'm trying to meet, but level of appropriation.
I don't follow the question.
Yeah.
If a pencil this year is $1, and next year is $1.10.
The default budget would cover $1.
Oh, okay, yes, you're saying we need to buy 100 pencils, and this year they cost $1 a pencil. Next year, we're gonna buy 100 pencils, but they cost $1.10, so should the default budget be $100, because that's what it cost this year, or should it be $110? The answer is it should be $100.
Right.
Right.
It's the dollar amount, not,
So you think with health insurance then? This year it's health insurance $100, next year it's $200. We're contractually required to provide health insurance, so it's $200.
That's a contract.
if it's, if it's a contractual obligation, that's different, yeah.
And if you don't contract your utilities, then your utility, that line, granted, it's a bottom line budget, but, right, because, you could transfer money in there later on anyway. So if you had $100 for electricity and this year it's gonna be $150, that means you gotta find $50 somewhere else to pull out.
Even if we know there's an increase?
Yeah, because you're not contracted.
That's my opinion. I will say, I know that there are towns that say, well, this is what we had to buy last year, and we have to buy the same amount this year, and the price is going up, so we put the increased price into the default budget. And I think there may be, believe it or not, different lawyers have different opinions.
We believe it. both sides could find an opinion to justify their end, and, I mean, that's why we try and get
But
the
it's-
real answer.
Yeah, because to me, it says appropriation, the law says appropriation.
And non-contractual as opposed to contractual.
My opinion is that if it's, it's the dollar amount, not the number of units that you're buying.
Correct.
And I would
Subject
agree
again
with that.
to contractual obligations.
The pencil example I agree with, it's things like healthcare and all that.
And-
Those are contractual.
Right.
And honestly, I know where some of those separate opinions come from, because, I mean, when gas prices spiked, however many years ago that was, I had a real hard time as I calculated the default budget that year, because, the gas numbers went through the roof. It was, and still had to run police cruisers, still had to run snowplows. What do I do?
Right.
It wasn't as simple as the box of pencils example, and the numbers were big numbers, and that was the first place that I know some of my colleagues and I really wrestled with, what's the right answer there?
It's exactly what I do every day.
Yeah.
The right answer is you go with the dollar amount. It's simple.
Okay, Ray, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, basically, no more a statement. I don't think when they designed Senate Bill 2 and the default budget law, that anybody really seen the fact that we're gonna go year after year on a default budget. I don't think anybody conceptualized that. Money was loose. You think about when Senate Bill 2 was put in, nobody had these kind of budget constraints. Costs were, although they were escalating, they were under control based on the salaries that people were making. All of a sudden, we have a whole reversal of a lot of different things, so.
Yeah, and frankly, I think, and I wasn't at the legislature when SB 2 was adopted, but my sense is that the default budget was kind of an afterthought. The thinking was, we want people to be able to vote on the budget in the voting booth rather than at an actual town meeting. And then someone said, but wait a minute, what if they vote no? We don't have a budget. And so they scrambled to find a solution, and this is what they came up with, the default budget. And almost every year since then, they've been trying to come up with a better way to define it.
So you got it right, it's in the minutes of the State House, that's exactly what.
Yeah.
And so conversely, I'm thinking from my time on the school board, you budget for 5 first-grade teachers, and the following year, your enrollment goes down. You are under no obligation to now reduce by a teacher in the default, if it's a dollar amount.
You're certainly not under any obligation to reduce the number of positions.
So do they, so
I think she's asking the default number.
a default number. In your default budget, you have, in your operating budget, you have budgeted for 5 teachers.
Right.
The following year, your enrollment goes down, you only need 4, so you put 4 in your operating budget. Does your default stay at that same level of 5?
At that point, it's a PR campaign, isn't it? How do you?
Because I
That's-
know that has come up before as costs fall.
Yep.
And now we find ourselves with higher default budgets than operating budgets, and that's something that people have questioned as well.
Right.
And so that, I would assume then, if it's the dollar amount, you keep the higher dollar amount. You don't arbitrarily lower it to make it look better.
You do, and that's one of the ways that people, the issue about inflating the default budget comes up. I mean, depending on the circumstances, and I don't know whether this has happened in Litchfield, but you certainly can have a situation where the default budget is higher than the proposed operating budget.
Yep.
And that leads to accusations that the selectmen or the school board have deliberately inflated the default budget. And I'm sure that may happen occasionally, but there are also legitimate, the times when it's legitimate that school enrollment has fallen, or, we decide for whatever, we've achieved savings at the transfer station, but the default budget is what it is. It was last year's budget with these additions and subtractions. And if our proposed operating budget is less than that, then that ought to be a good thing, not a bad thing. So, if the default budget is higher than the operating budget, it may be for perfectly legitimate reasons, or it may be for devious, cynical reasons. I like to assume that it's more often the former than the latter, but it kind of depends on.
But this committee has no visibility into validating that.
Well, you certainly can, if you want, you can go to whatever meeting of the selectmen where the default budget is being determined, and I don't know whether they sit and discuss it. I imagine that they probably do.
Yep.
In the default budget language itself, it says, default budget is defined as the amount of same appropriations as committing the operating budget of the previous year reduced and increased. So it's both.
Right.
As the case may be, by debt service, contracts, and other obligations previously incurred. So a teacher in the previously incurred could go up or down based on the circumstance, as the case may be. So I believe it's addressed right there. In this case, it wouldn't go up because you added a teacher, but it would come down because you removed a teacher, as the case may be, by obligations previously incurred. That was a previously incurred obligation, and in this case, would go down.
I think the previously incurred language means that there is some kind of contractual obligation that either is requiring you to continue to do something into the future, or the contractual obligation has ended. And so.
Oh, man, you're an attorney, you could argue that.
So a good example, I'll go back to John's, would be the healthcare issue. So your current contract for whatever labor you have includes healthcare this year. But next year's labor contract does not include healthcare. So your default budget, if you ended up with a default, would go down by the cost of healthcare because it wasn't contractually obligated. So
I think
works both ways.
I think that's probably right. And again, as with whatever the other issue we were discussing, I forget what it was, you need to look at each individual circumstance and figure out, because there are gray areas. Well, the last thing that I had on my list was the right to know law, and I'm guessing that you're all familiar with that. We're here meeting in public. I assume notice was posted. I know that someone's taking the minutes. So I don't need to tell you that you are a public body subject to the right to know law. I probably don't need to tell you. I don't know whether you ever have subcommittees, but if there is a subcommittee of the budget committee, that committee is subject to the right to know law, just as the full committee is.
All committees that are all committees that are subject.
Yeah. Your records, obviously the budget is a governmental record subject to disclosure, but communications, if one of you sends an email to everyone else on the committee, the statute defines a governmental record as any information created, accepted, or obtained by or on behalf of any public body or a quorum or majority thereof in furtherance of its official function. So if one of you sends an email to the rest of the committee saying, here's the information that I got about the police budget, that email is a governmental record and it's subject to disclosure.
Even if it's not a quorum, it says any body or quorum.
If that email goes to a majority of the committee, if one person sends an email to another, it hasn't been seen by a majority of the budget committee.
Because that's an or right here. It says, or obtained by or on behalf of any public body or a quorum or majority thereof.
Yeah, meaning if it's obtained by the entire public body or a quorum or
less.
majority.
Right, in other words, a public body being the entire body.
Right.
Or they're talking, in other words, less bodies as a quorum.
Fewer than 5, isn't it?
Well, you would be 5 here. My point is I'm trying to get a scope. So in other words, a public body being 9.
Right.
Or a quorum, which would be 5.
Right.
Right.
Right, so so it goes to,
Yeah.
sorry, if it went to 5 members,
Yeah.
or actually, if it went from 1 member to 4 other members, then 5 people have seen it. That's a governmental record and it's subject to recording. And I probably don't need to tell you that communications outside a meeting, especially the biggest problem that people have had is email communications. If you have a majority of the board discussing board matters by email, that's something that you shouldn't be doing. That's any deliberation or discussion of something that is within your jurisdiction by a majority has to be done at a public meeting. If 2 of you want to talk about something outside of a meeting, that's fine. But if 2 of you talk about it and then you talk to him and then he talks to her and she talks to her, the statute talks about sequential communications. It used to be a fairly common practice where a board needed to make a decision and they didn't want to have a meeting where, it might be the town administrator, I'm sure this doesn't happen here, the town administrator would call one selectman and say, we have this issue, what do you say? And then call the next selectman and then call the next selectman. You can't do that. That's a discussion outside of a meeting.
Yeah, we have chosen not to do emails, interactive emails. The only thing we do is when, for example, tonight, these are the days that people
Yep.
can meet. Please let me know your availability.
Yep, things like
Those are
that
the
are
only
fine.
back and forth that we allow, but we don't allow back and forth. It goes through me, and then at a meeting, I'll announce whatever emails have transpired.
Yeah, that's a good policy, or at least that's the safest policy, is to just not do it. Also, I'll just comment that I haven't seen people texting at this meeting.
There's no service.
There's no service in
Oh.
there.
I don't know how to do it.
Well, that's the ideal setup. We've been getting a lot of questions lately about texting during selectmen meetings or planning board meetings or whatever. And it's not clearly illegal, but it's a really bad idea
Yeah.
for all kinds of reasons. So if you meet in a place where there's no service, that solves the problem.
Interesting. Seems that would be a good thing to put in bylaws, too. That way,
Policies, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I've suggested a policy of no phone use except for, emergencies, with prior permission of the chair or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are family emergencies, but, I was a planning board member for 9 years and a selectman for 4 years, and most of the time, my daughter was home with a babysitter, and there was never any reason that I needed to answer a phone call, so I think it's pretty rare that you need to do that.
Mhm.
That's what I have. Done questions as we went, but if you have additional ones.
Are there any other, right?
Deliberative session is conducted by the budget committee or the board of selectmen?
Deliberative session is what?
Conducted or,
Oh, no, it's conducted by the moderator.
it's conducted, and you're taking it in the general ways, but you schedule it and organize it and all of that type of stuff.
Oh, the deliberative session is scheduled by the governing body. That's not a budget committee issue because of the budget committee only deals with the budget, and although that's probably 90% of what most people care about, there are other matters that go on at town meeting.
There'd be warrants that have nothing to do with the budget.
Right.
But at the deliberative session, whose responsibility is it to present the budget? Is it the budget committee because it's the budget committee's budget, or because the selectmen may have other things? Are they primary?
Again, it's the budget committee's budget, so it ought to be, and there's no law that says, the budget shall be presented by the Budget Committee, but it ought to be presented by the Budget Committee. I mean, in theory, you could have the deliberative session opens and you have the warrant and no one makes any presentation whatsoever. I've actually seen town meetings like that where there was a budget or a warrant article or whatever and no one had anything to say about it and the selectmen just kind of sat there and did nothing. That's not a good way to do things. There ought to be someone
Who speaks?
who can stand up and take people through the operating budget to, in whatever level of detail they think is appropriate, and that, I think that's an appropriate role for the Budget Committee.
Any other comments or questions or things that pique your curiosity? I think all my questions have been answered, or things that I know have come up throughout the last couple of years. Anything more from the audience? Okay. Well,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. It's been
Attorney Johnston. I have been involved in town politics for a number of years, and I never failed to learn something. I learned several things tonight. I thank you for your presentation and the work that you put into it. It's greatly appreciated.
Certainly.
Thank you so much.
Sure. It's been a pleasure. It's, I think, the first meeting I've been to in Litchfield,
Yeah.
so nice to be here.
All righty then. If there's nothing else to come before us tonight, is there a motion to adjourn? Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Aye. May 2nd.
Here's my bad side.